The smell of earth and sweat hung thick in the air, as thick as the weight of the lashes across the backs of those who toiled under the Georgia Sunday. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, the slaves of the Hastings plantation worked the land until their bodies broke beneath the strain. But of all the overseers who watched over them, none were more feared than McCullen. His hands were steady with the whip, and his eyes glinted with a cruelty that matched the land itself. But Samuel, a field hand who had grown strong through the years, knew one thing. There were ways to fight back. Ways to make the masters feel the sting of the lash that they so freely gave. The field was his battlefield, and McCullen would be his first target. This is the story of how one man, driven by years of suffering, buried his overseer alive beneath the very cotton fields that had bled his soul dry. Before we dig deeper into this buried chapter, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment, and if stories like this speak to your soul, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried for too long. The heat of Georgia's summer sun bore down on the cotton fields, turning the soil into a thick, suffocating mire of sweat and dust. The air was so thick with humidity, it felt like the world itself was slowly suffocating under the weight of its own heat. Samuel moved through the rows of cotton with the precision of a man who had spent years perfecting his craft, the art of survival. His calloused hands worked steadily, picking the cotton with practiced ease, but his mind was far from the task at hand. His thoughts were consumed by the one man he had grown to hate more than any other, Mr. McCullen, the overseer. McCullen was a man who had taken cruelty to an art form. His tall, lean frame towered over the enslaved workers as he patrolled the fields, a constant reminder of their powerlessness. He took pleasure in watching the sweat pour from their bodies, in hearing the crack of the whip as it landed across their backs. Samuel had witnessed it more times than he could count, McCullen's sadistic delight in causing pain, his need to humiliate and dominate. But it wasn't just the overseer's cruelty that had broken Samuel's spirit. It was the way McCullen had a way of making you feel like you were nothing, less than human, just a piece of property to be discarded when no longer useful. Today, like so many others, Samuel's thoughts were darkened by the image of McCullen's face, the sneer that always curled at the corner of his lips, and the gleam in his eyes as he punished those who had no means of defending themselves. Samuel's body ached from the long hours of work, but it was the anger, the burning rage inside of him, that kept him going. He had watched McCullen break people for years. He had seen men and women reduced to nothing, their spirits shattered by the overseer's brutality. And now, Samuel had finally had enough. He wasn't alone in his hatred. There were others who shared his pain, others who had witnessed McCullen's cruelty and felt the sting of the whip themselves. But Samuel was different. He had always been patient, always waited for the right moment to strike. He had learned to survive in this hellish world by keeping his head down, by remaining invisible. But now, as the sun beat down upon him and McCullen's shadow grew longer across the field, Samuel knew that the time had come to act. The overseer was near. Samuel could feel it, like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. The man was unpredictable, dangerous, and worse yet, he was drunk on power. As the day stretched on, McCullen's presence grew more and more oppressive. He had spent the morning lashing out at workers for the slightest mistakes, his voice booming with threats, his anger a weapon that he wielded with terrifying ease. Samuel didn't flinch as McCullen approached him, his steps heavy on the dirt, the sound of his boots echoing through the field like the ticking of a clock, counting down to the moment of reckoning. Samuel's heart beat steadily in his chest, his breath slow and controlled. He didn't look up at the overseer as McCullen stopped in front of him, but he could feel the man's eyes boring into him. "Hard at work, aren't we?" McCullen sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Maybe you think you're better than the others. Maybe you think I don't see how you walk around like you own the place. Well, let me remind you who's in charge here." Samuel stood tall, his back straight, his hands still as he held the cotton. He didn't flinch at McCullen's words. He had heard them all before, but this time, something was different. The fire inside him was burning brighter than ever. He knew that if he was ever going to break free of McCullen's tyranny, it had to be now. The overseer reached out, grabbing Samuel's arm with a grip that was as cold as iron. "You don't want to cross me, boy. I can make your life a living hell." Samuel's jaw clenched. For a moment, he considered the consequences of what he was about to do. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, but it wasn't fear that held him back. It was resolve. McCullen would not break him. Not today. Not ever. With a slow, deliberate motion, Samuel turned his head to face McCullen, locking eyes with him for the first time in years. The overseer's grip tightened, but Samuel didn't move. He didn't back down. "This is the last time you touch me," Samuel said, his voice low but filled with an icy resolve. "The last time you think you can break me." McCullen's face twisted in rage, his hand raising in preparation to strike, but it was too late. The years of suffering, of watching others fall at McCullen's hand, had led to this moment, and Samuel knew, deep down, that there was no turning back. This was the beginning of the end. The days following the confrontation between Samuel and McCullen were heavy with tension. The cotton fields had never seemed so vast, and the air never so thick with the weight of what was to come. Samuel moved through the rows of cotton with a quiet, determined purpose, his mind constantly working. Each pull of the cotton felt like a deliberate step forward, a motion in the long game he had set into motion. Samuel had spent his entire life keeping his head down, doing what was necessary to survive. But now, everything had changed. The fight that had been growing inside him for years had finally been ignited, and there was no going back. He knew that McCullen would be watching, that his every movement would be scrutinized, but Samuel was ready. He had seen enough cruelty to last 10 lifetimes, and he knew now that silence was no longer an option. The overseer had grown bolder in the days that followed. His anger had flared even more, and his punishments had become more severe. But Samuel noticed something else, something even more dangerous. McCullen was beginning to crack. The arrogance that had once fueled him, the belief that he could crush anyone under his heel, was starting to show signs of weakness. His temper was more erratic, his decisions more rash. The fear that had once kept Samuel and the others in line was slowly fading, replaced by something else, a quiet defiance, growing like a seed in the hearts of the enslaved. Samuel wasn't the only one who had seen the cracks in McCullen's armor. Word had spread through the quarters, soft whispers, knowing looks exchanged between field hands and houseworkers alike. The overseer's cruelty was no secret, but it had always been a thing of whispered dread, of helplessness. But now, something was changing. Something had been set in motion that could not be undone. There were others who shared Samuel's frustration, others who had borne the weight of McCullen's cruelty. It wasn't just the field hands who suffered under the overseer's hand. It was everyone, men, women, children, whose lives had been spent in servitude. Samuel had witnessed the broken bodies and spirits of the enslaved, seen them bend under the weight of McCullen's lash, their backs raw, their faces hollow with fear. But now, with every glance exchanged between the workers, every nod of understanding, Samuel could feel the tide beginning to turn. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking control, about fighting back in whatever way they could. Samuel wasn't just a field hand anymore, he was a leader, whether he had asked for it or not. And in that moment, he realized something that had been true all along. The power to overthrow their masters was in their hands. All they needed was the courage to act. Late one night, as the plantation lay still and quiet, Samuel gathered a small group of trusted slaves in the quarters. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and sweat, the oppressive heat of the summer night settling over them. They met in secret, their voices hushed, the weight of their plan heavy in the air. "McCullen's starting to slip," Samuel said, his voice low but steady. "He's growing careless. He thinks he has us all under control, but he's wrong." The others nodded, their faces a mixture of anger, fear, and determination. Samuel knew they were ready. They had been ready for a long time. They had lived under the heel of oppression for so long that it had become second nature. But now, something had changed. The fire inside them was real, and it was burning brighter with each passing day. "I've been watching," Samuel continued, his voice tight with the weight of his words. "We're going to strike when he least expects it. He's been tormenting us for too long. It's time we make him feel what we've felt." The group sat in silence for a long moment, the implications of Samuel's words sinking in. For years, they had lived in the shadows, their rebellion whispered in the dark. But now, the time had come to act. "I don't know if we can win this fight," one of the older men spoke up, his voice heavy with doubt. "They have the power, the guns, the soldiers. How can we defeat them?" "We don't need guns," Samuel replied, his voice hard with resolve. "We don't need to fight them on their terms. We fight them on ours. The land is ours as much as it is theirs. We know it better than they ever will. We'll use that." The room fell quiet again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from understanding. Samuel wasn't just asking them to follow him. He was asking them to rise with him, to take control of their own destiny. The plan they were formulating was risky, dangerous, but it was their only option. As the night stretched on, the group discussed their plan, each word weighed with the knowledge that they were not just planning a rebellion, they were planning a revolution. And with each passing hour, the sense of urgency grew. Samuel knew that McCullen's days as overseer were numbered, but what would come after that was anyone's guess. Would they be able to escape? Would they be able to outrun the consequences of what they were about to do? When the meeting was over, Samuel returned to his quarters, his mind buzzing with the weight of the decision he had made. He knew the risks, knew that one mistake could cost him everything, but the thought of continuing to live in fear, of watching his people suffer under McCullen's cruelty, was more unbearable than anything else. The time for silence had passed. The time for action had come. Days turned into weeks, and the air grew heavier with the weight of the plan. Samuel moved through the plantation like a shadow, his every step measured, his mind constantly turning over the details of what was to come. He had learned long ago how to remain unnoticed, how to blend into the background while quietly observing the movements of those around him. The overseer, Mr. McCullen, was becoming more erratic with each passing day, his temper growing shorter, his actions more reckless. Samuel knew that McCullen was slipping, and it was in those moments of carelessness that the opportunity to strike would come. In the fields, Samuel had become a master of subtle rebellion. He worked diligently, his hands moving as they always had, but his eyes were always scanning, always calculating. He had gathered a small group of loyal workers, each one trusted, each one ready to do whatever it took to bring McCullen down. They didn't speak openly about the plan. Too many ears were listening, too many eyes were watching. Instead, Samuel and his group communicated in the quietest of ways. A glance, a nod, a shift in the rhythm of their work. These were their signals, their ways of knowing that the time was near. The plantation itself was a sprawling, almost self-sustaining operation. There were rows upon rows of cotton, acres of land worked to the bone by the enslaved. But there was a divide between the overseers and the workers, a divide that McCullen had cultivated through years of brutal punishment and control. It was this very division, however, that Samuel was now planning to use against him. The overseers were always too quick to judge, too willing to strike when things weren't going according to their orders. But Samuel had learned the rhythm of the land. He knew the patterns, the small shifts that could throw the entire operation into chaos. It was in these quiet moments that Samuel's rebellion began to take root. He and his group would sabotage the cotton production in small, almost undetectable ways. A wrong turn in the field, a plow set too deep, a piece of equipment sabotaged at the perfect moment. McCullen, too blinded by his own authority, never suspected that the workers were capable of such acts. To him, they were nothing more than machines, tools to be used and discarded. Samuel's group moved in silence, knowing that they had to keep McCullen off balance, never allowing him to anticipate what was coming next. One morning, as Samuel worked in the fields, the overseer's voice echoed through the rows of cotton. "Move faster!" McCullen barked, his voice shrill with anger. "I won't have you slacking off while we're this close to the harvest. Keep working." Samuel didn't flinch. He had heard McCullen's commands 1,000 times before. But today, something in his gut twisted. McCullen's words weren't just orders, they were taunts, reminders of everything Samuel and the others had been forced to endure for years. The overseer's voice cut through the air like a whip, but Samuel's eyes narrowed, and he continued to work, slow and steady, as he always did. "Samuel," McCullen called out again, his voice now tinged with venom. "Why are you slowing down? Are you too good to work like the others?" Samuel turned his head slightly, locking eyes with McCullen for the first time that day. The overseer's glare was filled with contempt, but Samuel didn't back down. "I'm working," he said simply, his voice calm, controlled, the same as I always do. McCullen's face reddened, his lips curling into a sneer. "I won't tolerate any disrespect," he spat, stepping closer, his eyes flashing with anger. "You think you can speak to me like that and not suffer the consequences?" Samuel didn't flinch. He knew what McCullen was capable of. He had seen the overseer lash out at others for far less. But this time was different. This time, Samuel's patience had reached its limit. The overseer's power over them was built on fear. Fear that came from the lash, fear that came from the constant threat of punishment. But Samuel had learned that fear could be twisted, turned into something more dangerous. It was no longer enough to endure. He had to make McCullen feel the weight of his own cruelty. "I'm not afraid of you," Samuel said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "And I'm not the only one." McCullen stepped back, his face tightening in disbelief. For a moment, the two men stood facing each other, the tension between them thick and palpable. The air seemed to hum with electricity as McCullen's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching at his sides. Samuel could feel the shift in the overseer's demeanor, the realization dawning on him that Samuel was no longer the man he could break with a glance or a threat. He was something else, now something more dangerous. "You think you can get away with this?" McCullen sneered, his hand twitching toward his whip. "I'll make you regret this, boy. Heaven a great lined, heaven a great wide and heaven a greater. Heaven a great why. When the heaven a great, we would not coupling. 7 line. The words hung in the air, but they no longer held the same power. Samuel had already made his decision. He had already seen the path ahead of him, and it no longer led to fear. It led to something far more dangerous. As McCullen turned to storm away, Samuel's mind raced with the plan he had been formulating for so long. It was time. The moment had arrived. Samuel's rebellion was no longer a quiet, subtle thing. It was an inevitability. He could feel the weight of it settling on his shoulders, but he was ready. The overseer's reign of terror was about to come to an end, and Samuel, with the patience he had learned through years of suffering, would be the one to bring it to a close. The days that followed Samuel's confrontation with McCullen felt like the calm before a storm. The overseer, still fuming from the exchange, tried to maintain control over the fields with a more erratic fury, lashing out at anyone who dared to falter under his watch. But Samuel knew it wouldn't last. McCullen's grip on the plantation was slipping, his once unshakable authority had been tested, and now it was only a matter of time before he made a fatal mistake, and Samuel was waiting for it. Samuel's body moved through the fields with purpose, but his mind was constantly focused on the task at hand. The plan, which had once been a distant hope, was now a reality that loomed closer with each passing day. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and they were growing in the dark, ready to burst forth into the light. He could feel the change in the air, the tension among the workers, the fear in McCullen's eyes whenever he passed by. They were all waiting for the moment when the overseer's cruelty would come to a head, and Samuel would be the one to deliver the final blow. It wasn't just about McCullen anymore. It was about power, about taking back what had been stolen from them for so long. The land, the work, the very essence of their lives had been taken and twisted into something that served only the whims of their masters. But that was about to change. Samuel had come to realize that he didn't just want to survive anymore. He wanted to break the chains. He wanted to see McCullen brought to justice, and not just justice in the sense of retribution, but justice in the sense that they would never again be at the mercy of men like him. But the plan, as clear as it had become, was not without its risks. Samuel had to move carefully, almost imperceptibly, as if he were still the obedient worker who bent under the weight of the overseer's lash. He couldn't afford to act too soon, to show his hand before the time was right. McCullen was unpredictable. and the last thing Samuel wanted was to give him a reason to retaliate before he could finish what he had started. In the days that followed, Samuel continued to work the fields, his movements slow and deliberate. He observed McCullen from a distance, watched how the overseer would lash out at the smallest signs of resistance, how his temper would flare when things didn't go his way. It was only a matter of time before McCullen's rage led him to make a fatal mistake. And when that mistake happened, Samuel would be ready. The turning point came on a hot afternoon, when McCullen, his face red with rage, began to lash out at a group of field hands for a minor error. He grabbed a young man by the collar, throwing him to the ground with an animalistic growl. "You think you can do this work?" McCullen sneered. "You think you're worth a damn?" Samuel had seen this kind of brutality before. He had lived with it for as long as he could remember. But something about the way McCullen handled the young man, with such open malice and arrogance, stirred something deep inside of him. It was the final straw. This man, this overseer, had no right to treat people as less than human. And Samuel knew that if he didn't act now, if he didn't take control, McCullen's reign of terror would continue, unchallenged. McCullen turned to walk away, his steps heavy with the satisfaction of his cruelty. But Samuel's eyes followed him, his mind calculating, his heart pounding in his chest. The time had come. The overseer had been careless. Samuel's patience had paid off. He moved through the rows of cotton, his heart thundering in his ears. He didn't have much time. McCullen would be returning to the overseer's cabin soon, and if Samuel was going to make his move, it had to be quick. He had already gathered his group, those who had quietly followed him in his small acts of defiance. They were waiting for him, ready to act. The plan was simple. McCullen would be alone, in the fields, far from the other overseers. Samuel had been watching the overseer's habits for weeks, knowing when he would be most vulnerable. Now was the time to strike. With the group of field hands at his back, Samuel moved quickly, silently, until they reached the overseer's cabin. The door was locked, but Samuel knew how to get inside. He had spent years working on the plantation, learning its secrets, its weaknesses, and now those secrets would be his weapon. He entered the cabin, the wood creaking underfoot as he stepped inside. McCullen was there, his back to the door, fiddling with a map of the plantation. Samuel's pulse quickened, but he remained still, his breathing steady. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. "McCullen." Samuel's voice was low, but it rang with authority. The overseer turned quickly, his face flushed with the shock of being confronted. His hand reached for his belt, where his whip hung, but it was too late. Samuel moved with a speed born of desperation and anger. He grabbed McCullen's wrist, twisting it and forcing him to the ground. McCullen struggled beneath him, but Samuel was relentless. The overseer, a man who had terrified so many for so long, was now at his mercy. And for the first time, it was Samuel who held the power. In that moment, the years of suffering, of broken backs and bruised souls, came crashing down on McCullen like a tidal wave. Samuel's hands worked with purpose, with fury, as he dragged McCullen out of the cabin and into the fields, the very fields that had seen so many broken by the overseer's cruelty. The hole had already been dug. It was deep enough, hidden enough, that no one would notice McCullen's disappearance until it was too late. Samuel had prepared for this. He had waited for this moment, and now it was here. McCullen's struggles grew weaker as Samuel pushed him into the pit. The overseer's cries were muffled by the earth around him, his voice barely rising above the sound of the wind rustling through the cotton. Samuel stood above him, his heart pounding, his breath coming in shallow gasps. It was over. The overseer was buried beneath the very fields he had once ruled, the earth swallowing him whole. And with it, Samuel knew that something had changed forever. He had delivered justice, his justice, and now there was no going back. The sun had barely begun to rise the morning after McCullen's disappearance, and already the plantation was humming with an eerie energy, a kind of unnatural stillness. The workers went about their tasks, their movements mechanical, as if the very rhythm of the plantation had shifted. There were no sounds of McCullen's brutal commands, no snapping of the whip, no forced laughter to mask the cruelty. The fields, once so full of dread, now seemed quieter. But the silence was not one of peace, it was the silence of anticipation, the calm before the storm. Samuel moved through the fields like a shadow, his back straight, his eyes scanning every corner, every movement. He could feel the eyes of the other workers on him, the glances full of unspoken questions. He knew they were watching, wondering if this would be the moment when the plantation master would notice, when the overseers would come rushing in to restore order. But Samuel was ready. The time for fear had passed. The group of workers Samuel had gathered in secret watched him closely, waiting for his lead. It was in their eyes, too, the same defiance that had been building in Samuel for years. It was there in the way they moved, in the quiet determination of their tasks. The rebellion, though still a secret, was no longer something whispered behind closed doors. It was a truth that had been carved into the very land they worked. By midday, whispers had begun to spread throughout the quarters, murmurs growing louder as more and more slaves began to ask where McCullen had gone. The overseer's absence had been noted, but no one dared to speak of it too openly, not yet. There were still too many dangers, too many ways the truth could be twisted, but it wouldn't take long for suspicion to turn into something more. Samuel could feel it, a rising tide of fear, of questions that would soon demand answers. It wasn't long before the first search began. The plantation owner, Mr. Hastings, had been alerted to McCullen's disappearance, but no one knew where to begin looking. The overseer's cabin was empty, his personal effects scattered across the floor, but there was no sign of the man himself. The workers were questioned, but none of them spoke. Samuel had been clear in his instructions. Silence was the key. If they remained quiet, they could hold out just a little longer. As the sun began to set, a wave of unease settled over the plantation. Samuel watched from the edge of the fields as Mr. Hastings and a group of overseers gathered near the cabin. Their voices were low, their faces set in grim determination, but no one seemed to know what had happened to McCullen. Samuel knew it was only a matter of time before they would turn on the workers, begin to question them more directly. The longer they waited, the more dangerous it became. Later that evening, after the shadows had grown long and the workers had finished their tasks for the day, Samuel met with his small group of trusted allies. They gathered in secret, deep in the woods behind the fields, far from the prying eyes of the overseers. Samuel could see the tension in their faces, the nervous energy that had been building since McCullen's disappearance. They all knew what would happen if they were caught. But they also knew that they had come too far to turn back now. "We need to move," Samuel said quietly, his voice low but firm. "The Hastings will be coming for us. McCullen's death hasn't gone unnoticed. We have to leave before they find out the truth." The others nodded, their eyes wide with fear but also a fire that had begun to burn in them too. They had followed Samuel this far, and now there was no turning back. They would either escape or they would be caught, and in either case, Samuel knew the end was inevitable. But before they could begin to make their plans, a voice cut through the air. It was one of the younger field hands, panting and out of breath from running. "Samuel," he gasped. "They know." The others tensed, the blood draining from their faces. Samuel's heart dropped into his stomach. "What do you mean?" "They're looking for the overseer. They're asking questions, too many questions. Mr. Hastings," he said, "someone's going to pay for this." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Samuel knew that it was only a matter of time before they would find out the truth. The overseers would begin to piece things together. The whispers of rebellion would begin to rise louder. And when they did, Samuel and his group would be blamed. The consequences would be swift and brutal. "They'll come for us," Samuel said quietly, the weight of the reality sinking in. "And when they do, we need to be ready." The group fell silent as the gravity of the situation settled over them. The plan they had worked on for so long, the quiet rebellion, the hope of escape, was now a dangerous gamble. Every step from here on out would be fraught with risk. But there was no turning back. The overseer was dead, buried beneath the cotton fields. And with him, Samuel had started a fire that would never be put out. The consequences of their actions would follow them, but they had already crossed the point of no return. "We have to leave tonight," Samuel said, his voice firm. "Prepare what you can. Meet me at the riverbank when the moon rises." The others nodded, the fear in their eyes giving way to the resolve that had been growing in them ever since Samuel had started speaking of freedom. The time for running had come. The time for hiding was over. They would either escape or die trying. As Samuel watched his people disperse into the night, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what he had done. He had buried McCullen in the earth, but now, it seemed, the earth itself was preparing to bury them all. The fire he had started had begun to spread, and there was no way to stop it. But even in the face of the overwhelming odds against them, Samuel held his head high. He had fought back, and for that, he would never be a slave again. The night was dark, the kind of dark that pressed in on all sides, thick and heavy, as if the very world was holding its breath. Samuel and his group made their way to the riverbank, their footsteps muffled by the wet ground beneath them. The air was cool, the stillness of the night broken only by the distant rustle of leaves in the trees and the quiet murmur of water rushing downstream. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever across the land they were leaving behind. Every step Samuel took felt like a step into the unknown. The plantation was behind them now, far enough that they couldn't see the burning lights of the house in the distance, far enough that they could finally breathe, if only for a moment. But there was no time to waste. They had to move quickly. The pursuit would come, and when it did, it would be relentless. The river stretched out before them, a dark and silent force that would carry them away from the plantation, away from the life they had known. The boat was waiting, just as they had planned, hidden in the reeds at the edge of the water. The conductor, a man Samuel had never met, but who had been trusted by others, stood at the ready. His face was barely visible in the shadows, but the flash of his eyes as he saw the group approach was enough to know that he understood the danger they were in. They had no time to waste. This was their only chance. "We make for the north," Samuel said quietly, his voice low but filled with a quiet authority. "No turning back now. The Underground Railroad will take us farther, but we need to get there first." The others nodded, their expressions grim but determined. They had come this far, and there was no going back. Samuel's heart raced, but he pushed the fear down. Fear was a luxury they couldn't afford. The overseer was dead. The plantation had already begun to feel the ripples of his death, and soon the ripple would become a wave. The family would retaliate, and they would look for anyone who might be behind it. Samuel knew that if they were to survive, they had to keep moving, keep disappearing into the night like ghosts, leaving no trace behind them. As they boarded the boat, Samuel glanced back once more at the plantation that had been his prison. The land stretched out before him, bathed in the dim light of the moon. He would never forget the faces of the others, of those he had watched suffer under McCullen's tyranny, of those who had been broken by the land. And yet, Samuel knew he had done something no one had ever done before. He had taken control. He had struck back. He had delivered justice. And though the cost had been high, it was a cost he had been willing to pay. The boat began to move, its hull gliding silently through the water, the soft splash of the oars barely making a sound. Samuel sat at the bow, his eyes fixed on the horizon, but his thoughts were still on the plantation, on the family that would never rule that land again. He had made sure of that. McCullen was dead, buried beneath the cotton fields that had been his domain. The land would no longer be ruled by terror, by cruelty. It would become something else, a symbol of resistance, of the fire that had burned for so long and now burned even brighter. As the boat drifted farther from the plantation, the sounds of the world grew quieter. The weight of the night began to settle into Samuel's bones, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to relax. He was no longer a slave. He was no longer bound by the land, by the overseers, by the chains that had held him for so long. He was free. And in that freedom, he could finally see the path ahead of him, a path that led not just to the north, but to something much greater, something that would echo through the generations. The journey was far from over. The road to freedom was long, and Samuel knew that the risks were still high. But now, he carried with him a legacy. His actions, his rebellion, would live on in the hearts of those who had followed him. He had planted the seeds of change, and though he couldn't see it yet, those seeds would grow. The boat moved steadily downstream, the moonlight reflecting off the ripples of the water. Samuel didn't look back again. The past was gone now, swallowed up by the river, by the fire he had set. The future stretched out before him, uncertain and dangerous, but filled with possibilities he had never dreamed possible. And though he knew there would be others who would fight for freedom, others who would pick up the mantle of rebellion, Samuel knew that he had made a difference. His actions had sparked a fire that could not be extinguished. The story of McCullen's death, of his own rebellion, would live on, passed from one generation to the next, a symbol of what could happen when one man decided to stand up and take control. In the years to come, Samuel's name would be spoken in whispers, passed along in secret. His story would be told in the fields, in the quarters, in the places where people still carried the weight of oppression. And though Samuel had escaped the plantation, he had left behind a legacy that would burn forever in the hearts of those who had been told they were nothing. He had made them something. He had made them free.